Imagine booting up a browser game in 2003 and quietly being trained for how you'd behave online for the next 20 years. RuneScape wasn't just a fantasy world, it was a live experiment on what happens when you drop millions of strangers into a shared space before anyone has agreed on how to behave online.
These people were playing the game, 5, 10 hours, 15 hours a day, every single day. And
good, strong friendships that have come from just playing RuneScape.
Inside that chaos, RuneScape quietly started solving problems the early internet was fumbling with: spam, impersonation, bots, and abusive speech. It didn't solve these problems with rulebooks or forum posts, but with guided systems baked directly into the world itself. It taught players to prove they were really there, to reshape their speech, and to treat tiny symbols next to a name as unquestioned authority, all without ever handing them a rulebook. What matters isn't just that these systems existed, but how early they appeared. RuneScape arrived at solutions years before the wider internet would catch up, sketching out how large online spaces would eventually be structured and governed. To see where this massive experiment really begins, we have to rewind, back to the messy origin when RuneScape opened its gates and nothing about behaving online had settled into place. In the early 2000s, the internet was still establishing norms for shared trust, speech, and authority. RuneScape launches directly into that vacuum, a massive, persistent social system with no inherited norms to lean on, echoing the social problems of the entire early web. In RuneScape's earliest years, public chat was volatile and poorly understood. In late 2001, Jagex briefly experiments with an extreme censorship system that only allows words from a pre-approved dictionary, causing normal sentences and even usernames to vanish or mutate unpredictably. The system is rolled back almost immediately after players' backlash, but the damage is done. Players now know that words can disappear, change, or fail silently inside the chat box. And the same confusion is playing out across the entire early internet, where chat rooms and forums inconsistently censor language, replace words without warning, or fail to explain moderation at all. In these early days of RuneScape, there is also no reliable way to tell who actually represents Jagex. Players routinely impersonate staff by simply claiming to be moderators, creating usernames that sound official, or threatening bans in public chat. Community warnings from the era explicitly caution players that anyone claiming authority without visible proof is likely scamming. The same pattern appears across the early internet, where forum admins, IRC operators, and official support figures often exist only by tone or confidence, teaching users painfully that online authority is something that anyone can pretend to have. By around 2002, players begin noticing characters that behave wrong, endlessly repeating the same actions, never responding to chats, and flooding areas with identical behavior. Early bots or autoers in RuneScape mine, fish, chop, or spam without pause, revealing that RuneScape's social space can be occupied not just by bad actors, but by machines pretending to be people. Reporting on these bots fails because the behavior isn't yet clearly defined as cheating. It's simply uncanny. Players don't have a shared concept of bots, only the growing sense that scale has invited something inhuman into the crowd. This new automated behavior mirrors a wider early internet realization happening at the same time, as email inboxes, forums, and chat rooms quietly fill with automated messages before anyone has language, norms, or tools to deal with them. RuneScape becomes one of the first places where ordinary users encounter the idea that not everyone online is a person. At this point in the story, RuneScape has gathered millions of strangers into one shared space, but neither players nor developers yet know how behavior in a world like this is supposed to work. In order to keep the world functional, RuneScape introduced subtle systems that didn't control behavior but quietly trained it. While none of these ideas were entirely new, RuneScape's scale made them a lived, shared experience for millions, establishing a behavioral meta that still shapes how online spaces work today. By around 2003, RuneScape's early chaos had become impossible to ignore. Botting is rampant, chat is unreadable, and scams are normalized. But instead of issuing manifestos or relying on moderators alone, Jagex takes a different approach. Systems are added quietly, embedded directly into how the game works. Players are not told how to behave. They are shaped by what the interface allows them to do. Governance moves from rules on a web page to infrastructure. RuneScape Classic quietly adds the fatigue system. As players perform actions, an invisible meter fills. At 100%, skills still work, but experience gain stops. There's no alert, no scolding, and no visible penalty. Progress simply freezes. For the first time, the system, not the player, decides how long productivity can continue. Bots are throttled, but so are humans. Progress is no longer infinite. It's rate limiting by design. The only way to reset fatigue is to stop and sleep, in a bed or using a sleeping bag in-game. This inserts a mandatory pause directly into the core gaming loop. Crucially, it isn't framed to the players as discipline or moderation. Sleeping is just another game mechanic. Player guides from 2003 list optimal sleep timing alongside mining routes. Players talk while resting, and what could have felt like a restriction becomes routine in the game. Waking up from these sleep cycles requires typing a randomly generated word correctly. At the time, it reads as a quirky flourish on the game, but in retrospect, it's unmistakable. A CAPTCHA has been embedded directly into gameplay. Jagex never names it, but the intent is clear. Bots fail, humans comply. RuneScape pioneers verification through friction years before CAPTCHA becomes a widespread web phenomenon. And this logic doesn't stay in just RuneScape, it becomes foundational to the modern internet. When Google introduces early image-based CAPTCHAs in the mid-2000s, users are not told why they're being slowed down, only that progress requires effort. When Twitter rate limits tweets or Reddit quietly slows high-velocity posting, the goal is not punishment, it's to separate people from scripts. What RuneScape does unusually early in the history of the internet is normalize this contract with the user. If you act too efficiently, too endlessly, and too perfect, the system responds, not with force, but with a bit of friction. Millions of players learn this before the web has a language for it, long before CAPTCHA, rate limiting, or bot mitigation become standard terms for the internet. Alongside activity controls, Jagex quietly begins reshaping speech on the platform. Early RuneScape chat filters block profanity and famously replace some banned words with the word cabbage, later switching cabbage to asterisks. The system never explicitly tells users what it's doing. It doesn't warn or negotiate with users. It simply alters output. Players learn the boundaries only by colliding with them. A word disappears, or gets starred out, or even mutates mid-sentence. For many users, this is their first encounter with machine-enforced language, speech mediated by an algorithm rather than a person. However, players don't stop talking. They adapt. They learn spacing tricks, deliberate misspellings, and euphemisms spread throughout RuneScape almost immediately. It's not what you say, but whether the system will let it through. The result is a new kind of literacy, learning how to phrase thoughts so an algorithm will allow them. This pattern becomes the default mode of communication on the modern web. On YouTube, creators avoid words that trigger demonetization, substituting euphemisms like unalive. On other social media platforms, entire dialects emerge to bypass moderation filters. On Twitter and Reddit, users learn which spellings survive, which phrases trip filters, and which topics collapse reach. The lesson is the same as RuneScape's early chat box. Expression is no longer interpersonal. It's negotiated with systems. RuneScape introduces this dynamic before most platforms even attempt moderation at scale. Players learn, intuitively and early, that visibility will depend on your compliance with the system. You don't argue with the filter, you work around it. In 2004, Jagex introduces player moderators, unpaid volunteers selected from the community. They are visibly identical to regular players except for a small silver crown next to their name. This symbol changes everything. When a crowned moderator speaks in a crowded bank, behavior visibly shifts. Spam stops, language in the room cleans up, and scammers disappear. Authority is no longer abstract to the game. Player moderators at the time have limited powers, muting, reporting priority, and other small controls. They are not employees, but merely police of the game, yet their influence far outweighs their tools. Jagex doesn't actually have to flood the world with staff moderators because players internalize the idea that they could be present at any moment. Once this shifts, enforcement becomes an ambient part of the game. Just the idea of the crown is often enough for moderation. RuneScape demonstrates that large systems don't need constant intervention. They need symbols that everyone recognizes and respects. This model becomes the backbone of the modern internet. Reddit moderators, Discord admins, Wikipedia editors, and forum staff. Vast systems governed by unpaid volunteers with badges and limited tools. A 2015 analysis famously calls moderators the great unpaid backbone of the internet. RuneScape is an early, highly successful proof that this model works. Governance is outsourced to the users. None of these systems were just fixes for RuneScape's problems. Together, they trained millions of users in how platform life works. They taught users to accept friction, pause when told, filter their speech, verify their humanity, and respect symbolic authority. RuneScape didn't just survive the chaos of the early web. It quietly taught an entire generation how to live inside it. RuneScape didn't just manage its own chaos. It established a shared, transferable understanding of how large online spaces govern behavior long before that understanding was explicit. For a large portion of early 2000s internet users, RuneScape is their first sustained experience inside a massive, persistent online community. This isn't speculative. Players repeatedly describe how RuneScape is their first exposure to online communities at scale. In retrospective threads like "What has RuneScape taught you that you now bring into your real life?" and "How has RuneScape affected your life?" players consistently note that RuneScape was where they first learned how to talk to strangers online, use shared chat spaces, and exist alongside thousands of other users in real time. One user explicitly calls it our form of social media before social media existed. In other retrospectives, users note that features like chat filters, trade confirmations, and fatigue didn't feel like restrictions so much as just how the game worked. This matters because when these same users later encountered swear filters, rate limits, or moderator badges on other websites, they described them as familiar rather than surprising. The expectation of a mediated interaction has been set with many. In one PC Gamer retrospective, one player explicitly states that old-school RuneScape functions as a time capsule of mid-2000s cybersecurity, noting how many modern safety assumptions were learned there first. RuneScape did not set out to define how the internet should work, but through real incidents, real systems, and millions of lived hours, it taught an entire generation how large online spaces behave and what kind of rules they inevitably require. Long before checkmarks, cooldowns, filters, and community moderators became standard, RuneScape made them feel normal. Its legacy isn't just nostalgia, it's the social literacy that quietly underpins modern life on the web.